I'm going to talk about creating the space in the classroom for collaboration and community, but in order to start, I'm going to go back to elementary school. Now, as an elementary school student, I was a handful. I was never following directions. I was never where I was supposed to be at the right time. And I remember I was sick for about a week. And I came back to class, and I was up to my normal antics, just running around the classroom. And my teacher stopped, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said, "Douglas, it was so nice and quiet last week when you weren't here." And I don't remember much else of that year. But what has stayed with me from that day was the way that I felt when she said that. I felt like the bottom had dropped out. I felt like I was invisible. I felt as if she were telling me that the classroom, it was a better place without me in it. And I was devastated. Now, I think it's one of the laws of cosmic justice that if you're a terrible student, you're going to come back as a teacher and have a classroom of students who are just like you. And so that's kind of what happened. I ended up teaching first grade, but luckily for me, I had a great mentor teacher, Karen Ivins. And Mrs. Ivins was tall and stately and elegant, and she always looked put together, and everybody listened. When Mrs. Ivins had a teachable moment, everybody would stop what they were doing and they would listen, all of these first graders. I would listen too. We were all captivated, and I wanted to be just like Mrs. Ivins. I wanted to be the master of the teachable moment. I wanted to have them in the palm of my hand and have their rapt attention. I didn't have it at the beginning. I remember there was a time when we were out on the playground, and when one of the students was running across the playground towards the street, and I yelled after him. I said, "Justin, stop!" And he kept going. So I yelled again. I said, "Justin, stop right there!" And he just kept going. And Mrs. Ivins, at my shoulder, she turned around and in a voice not much louder than her normal speaking voice, she said, "Justin, that's quite enough." And he put the brakes on and stopped. And he was like farther down the street than he was when I had been yelling at him. I couldn't figure it out, but I resolved to figure out what was it about Mrs. Ivins that made her special. Was it her voice? Was there something magical and mystical about her voice? Something about how she said things? Was it the fact that she never really yelled? Maybe I yelled too much. Was it the way she dressed? I thought maybe dressing a little more formally. She always wore really beautiful dresses, sort of right down to the floor. And I didn't wear dresses, but probably would have worked for a little bit. I started dressing a little bit more nicely when I went in, and it didn't make any difference. The first graders didn't really seem to care whether I had a necktie on or not. Maybe it was the way that she always used their first name when she spoke to them, so that they knew that she was talking directly to them. I thought that after a year with Mrs. Ivins, I would figure it out, but I never really did. By the end of the year, I didn't feel that I was capturing their attention any more than I started. But I went on, and I taught more. And later on in my career, I was a technology specialist at a middle school. And I had a standing meeting with Jenny, the middle school head, and I would go in there with all of these questions and plans and problems, and she'd always start every meeting by saying, "Douglas, how are you today? What are you doing this weekend? How's your wife? What are you planning for the spring break?" And I would stop and I would talk and I would answer her. And she would remember the answers. And we'd get into talking, and before we realized it, most of the hour would be up. And we never really got to talking about all the important stuff, like how the budget was going to get filed, or which purchase orders were going to get filled, or how we were going to schedule the science teachers in and out of the computer lab the next week. And so for a while, I actually thought that, maybe Jenny's just not really good at time management. She just, But, believe it or not, somehow the budget still got filed, purchase orders got filled, and that computer lab just kind of seemed to run itself after a while. And it wasn't until many years later, when I had my own staff and I had my own meetings, that I realized that by starting every meeting, by focusing on me, Jenny was telling me that I was more important than any of those problems or questions. Those things would work themselves out. But what I thought was important, what I thought mattered, and that the middle school was a better place because I was in it. And I went back to thinking about my days with Mrs. Ivins, and I thought about the times that I had observed her with her arms full of books, walking up the stairs, and she'd stop and she'd put the books down on the stair, and she'd help a little boy tie his shoe. Sometimes she would reach out and she'd just tussle a child's hair for no reason, but just to say, you and I are here together in this moment, and that's special. I thought about the way she would greet every child by name every morning, and she would ask them questions. How are you doing today? How's the pet bunny? I know your dad was off on a trip. Did he come back? How does that make you feel? You must be really happy. And when I thought about it, I realized something. You see, I had always thought that great teaching happened in the teachable moments. But I finally realized that great teaching happens in the spaces between those moments. Great teaching happens in all of the things that you do, and all of the conversations that you have, and all of the ways that you provide for students to get to know you and to get to know each other as individuals. Great teaching happens in all of the ways that you tell students that they matter, and that the technologies, the tools, and the projects may change, but one thing doesn't change, that you are an essential part of the classroom, and that no one is invisible. Everyone has value. And so with these lessons, I tried to take these lessons to heart and apply them in my own teaching. I teach computer science. I've tried to build community and have kids realize that it's not about me in that classroom, it's about us. So we have a Slack channel. We've set up a Slack channel so that kids can support each other. It's kind of like an online environment. And now we've kept that Slack channel running for about 3 years, and we've got people are coming back after about 3 years, and we have students who took the course 3 years ago, they've graduated, and students will come up with questions, often after my bedtime. They'll post it and say, I'm really stuck, can someone help me? And some other student will come in and help them. Not because they're getting class credit, but simply for the reason to help somebody else. We have a puzzle day where we actually get kids together. It's open not just to computer science students, but to anybody who's interested in solving puzzles and having fun. We give them a packet of puzzles, and we give them pretzels and pizza, and we get together and just help each other. We actually experimented with creating a collaborative final exam. So typically, we always used to do this. We'll give them 4 pretty difficult problems before the winter break, and we'll say, go research these, work on them, and solve them. But when they come into the testing room, it's closed book, and they have a set amount of time to take one of those problems at random. We assign them a problem, and then they need to actually write down the solution to the entire problem. And it's pretty rigorous. But what we do now is we have them work on it for an hour, and then at that hour we stop and we collect all the papers and we redistribute them randomly. And so you'll get somebody else's final exam in progress back. And now it's your job, and it's probably going to be a different problem, but now you need to give them feedback and say, I see what you're doing here, don't forget about this step, or I think you made a mistake here, you might want to check this. And we then collect them and pass them back out again. Then you have half an hour to incorporate some of the comments that you got. It's not enough time to completely redo your strategy, but it is enough time to use the help of a classmate to make your solution better. And then you're graded not just on what you knew about the problem, but also your corrections for other people. And what we hear from students is they say they actually work harder on this kind of an exam, not because they know they're going to be tested on one of the problems, but because they're actually very ashamed to get somebody else's work and not be able to provide useful help to them. So the motivation has changed from being simply about individual achievement to helping us get together as a group. And so these are some examples of things that we try to provide so that we get to know kids and that kids can get to know each other's strengths and show them in different ways. In many ways, it reminds me of a story. I have a colleague who purchased a house and on a hill, and on the grounds of the house there was a tree. And this tree made some of the worst oranges that you can possibly imagine. They had like really thick skin, and they were really sour. And they said, we're going to have to cut this tree down and put in something that's actually useful. But actually, her dad is a farmer, and he came over to visit one night. And he looks at these oranges, these thick-skinned, sour oranges, and he said, oh, no, those aren't oranges. Those are actually lemons. They're like really big orange lemons, some variety of lemon. And the funny thing is, as soon as they realize they're lemons, they're like, wow, these are really sweet. And they give a lot of juice. And so they started thinking about all these different things they could do. They could make like key lemon pie. You can make an entire pitcher of lemonade with just 3 lemons. it was pretty amazing. They started thinking of all these possibilities. And so the tree went from being useless to being one of probably the most useful tree on their property. But the funny thing is, the fruit didn't change. The tree was the same. What changed was the context. As soon as we stopped thinking of them as bad oranges, we realized they were really sweet lemons. And I think a lot about that and about how often at the beginning of the year I tend to label kids. I tend to think about them as a certain way. But the more opportunities you give kids to shine and show their strengths, the more possibilities open up for them. Because, you see, as teachers, we have a pivotal role. We need to create these learning environments for kids. And understanding where kids come from and understanding their strengths helps us to more effectively put together an environment that capitalizes on our kids' strengths. It helps show kids that they're important, that they're safe, that they have value. And once you have all those things in place, that's what creates the space for learning to happen. Thank you.